All right, hello and welcome to tutorial number 8. So we've almost made it to the end of this course, and we're making it to the final tutorial on the writing process. So today we're going to be covering editing. A lot of the time you might, or a common piece of advice you might hear is that writing is rewriting. So this is usually what's going on in the editing stage. It could also be considered the kind of like rewriting, reformatting phase as well. So yeah, the pieces of advice I'm going to be giving out today are going to be especially relevant once you've finished kind of composing that first draft or kind of skeleton or outlining or however you go about writing the paper. But once you kind of got your first version of it, I'm going to be providing tips to kind of just make sure everything's clear, everything's in place, things are going to be, and that will help you to be more concise. Yeah, if you haven't already, make sure to watch the previous 2 tutorials, which will give you more guidance on actually composing assignment 2. And this, today's tutorial is going to be, totally oriented around the editing process. So I'm going to start off by providing some general editing strategies, which will relate back to some of the things that we've been talking about in previous tutorials, especially things about like active voice and stuff like that. Then I'll get a bit more concrete in terms of what kind of questions you should be asking yourself when you're editing this assignment. And then we'll, as usual, there'll be a exercise at the end where I'm going to ask you to go back to your assignment 1 and find, perhaps a really long paragraph or a paragraph that you feel could be broken into 2 or something like that, and go ahead and edit it down to a smaller paragraph. Or taking a paragraph that's pretty effective and just making it much more effective. So yeah, we'll get into that shortly, but first I want to go through a story. This time it's provided by Stephen King on his non-fiction book on writing. So let's get into it. Alright, so I'm pulling out the story from Stephen King's book on writing, and yeah, it's a pretty interesting read if you're, interested in Stephen King. I'd say, my review would be there's not tons of writing advice throughout, but it's an interesting reflection on somebody who has not only written a lot but achieved some sort of cultural notoriety through their writing. But anyway, yeah, so the story I wanted to share from this book is what he calls the most important writing lesson he ever learned, and it was and so yeah, I'll just get into it. So basically what happened is that when he was in high school, he had been a newspaper editor for a while, and high school newspaper, and found it boring. And one day when he was procrastinating, he came up with a satiric version of the high school newspaper, which he called the Village Vomit, kind of after the Village Voice, I guess. And he kind of wrote it in Mad Magazine style, where he was parodying his teachers and giving them names like Maggot, and I've heard Miss Raypack was Mrs. Ratpack, things like that. Anyway, so once he writes it, he says, as all sophomoric humorists must be, I was totally blown away by my own wit. What a funny fellow I was. A regular Milltown H.L. Mackin. I have no idea who that is either. I simply must take the vomit to school and show all my friends. They would bust a collective gut. As a matter of fact, they did bust a collective gut. But then he quickly found himself getting in trouble, and some of the teachers wanted him suspended from school. He sits down with the principal, has to do an apology, and then sooner or later, the guidance counselor calls him down to the office and says, hey, we know that you're writing and you're kind of getting yourself into trouble. Why don't we try to make this more productive? And he kind of links him up with the editor of a local newspaper, and they're like, yeah, we're looking for a sports writer. And they're like, yeah, so we're not telling you have to do this, but we're strongly encouraging you to do it. So he does it, and he's like, I'm sort of grateful because that's this led to my biggest writing lesson. So let me find the passage here. So yeah, once he gets to the newspaper offices, he says, "Now that I was away from the administrative offices of Libsyn High, I felt able to muster a little honesty. I told Mr. Gould, the newspaper editor, that I didn't know much about sports. Gould said, 'These are games people understand when they're watching them drunk in bars. You'll learn if you try.'" So he gives him an assignment to go cover a high school basketball game. Or no. Yeah, a high school basketball game. And he writes, "The first two pieces I turned in had to do with a basketball game in which an LHS player broke the school scoring record. One was a straight piece of reporting. The other was a sidebar about Robert Ransom's record-breaking performance. I brought both to Gould the day after the game, so he'd have them for Friday, which is when the paper came out. He read the game piece and made 2 minor corrections and spiked it. Then he started in on the feature piece, the large black pen. I took my fair share of English lit classes in my 2 remaining years at Libsyn, and my fair share of composition, fiction, and poetry classes in college. But John Gould taught me more than any of them, and in no more than 10 minutes. I wish I still had that piece. It deserves to be framed, editorial corrections and all. But I can remember pretty well how it went, and how it looked after Gould had combed through it with that black pen of his." And then this is his reconstruction of the edits, which we'll go through and then talk about the lesson that he's getting out of it here. So last night in the well-loved, crossed-out gymnasium of Libsyn High School, partisans and Jay Hills fans alike were stunned by an athletic performance unequaled in school history. Bob Ransom, known as Bullet Bob for both his size and accuracy, is crossed out, scored 37 points. Yes, you heard me right. He did it with grace, speed, and an odd courtesy as well, committing only 2 personal fouls in his night-like quest, that's edited to quest, for the record, which has eluded Libsyn and Thinclads. Who knows what that means? He changed it to players since 1955, which used to be the Years of Korea. Gould stopped at the Years of Korea and looked up at me. "What year was the last record made?" he asked. Luckily, I had my notes. 1953, I said. So, you can see that he's correcting like these weird words, Thinclads. Who's going to know that necessarily? I'm sure that I'm not familiar with that word. I'm not sure if you are. And the Years of Korea, it's not necessarily clear to readers that, I mean, today that he's talking about the Korean War. I'm sure it was back then, but, this editor had the foresight to be like, let's make this clear. So when he finished marking my copy in the manner indicated above, he looked up and saw something on my face. He must have mistaken it for horror. It wasn't. It was pure revelation. Why, I wondered, didn't English teachers ever do this? It was like the visible man old Rod Deal had on his desk in the biology room. I think he means like the skeleton or like the see-through organ kind of people. I only took out the bad parts, Gould said. Most of it's pretty good. I know, I said, meaning both things. Yes, most of it was good. Okay, anyway, serviceable. And yes, he had only taken out the bad parts. I won't do it again. He laughed. If that's true, you'll never have to work for a living. You can do this instead. Do I have to explain any of these marks? No, I said. And then, this is the key part here. When you write a story, and when you're writing a paper, the first draft, I would say, you're telling yourself the story, or you're writing the first draft for yourself. When you rewrite, your main job is taking out all of the things that are not the story, or that aren't relevant to a sociological research proposal, or the specific one that you're doing for the assignment. Gould said something else that was interesting on the day I turned in my first 2 pieces. Write with the door closed and rewrite with the door open. There's a little bit more here. Your stuff starts out being just for you, in other words, but then it goes out. And once you know what the story is and get it right, or as right as you can anyway, It belongs to anyone who wants to read it or criticize it. And then he makes the point that if you write it really well, and for other people, people will be more likely to want to read it than to want to criticize it. Yeah, so that story is important for thinking about like what is editing and how do you do it, right? Trying to make things as clear as possible for readers. Yeah, writing for readers and not for yourself. Yeah, so I hope that will help us to start getting thinking, start thinking about editing. Now we'll get into some kind of basic strategies for editing in general, and then sentences, and then paragraphs, and then sections, and then we'll get into the actual sections of the research proposal, and I'll offer you some concrete advice on that. All right, so I'm sure you're already familiar with these, but it's worth kind of talking about them and how it's worth thinking about them. I'm not going to talk so much about spell check. That's pretty obvious what it is. Word is pretty helpful on that, and it can also kind of check confusing phrases and stuff and offer you alternatives. So always a good option to go through that first once you've got your first draft, just to make sure that the grammar and stuff is good. Thesaurus, and these aren't for a thesaurus is generally is a very memeable object, and basically kind of people using it to make themselves sound smarter than they are. But I would argue instead thinking about a thesaurus as a resource for finding the simplest words that you can. And I want to say this especially in the editing phase, because you're definitely grappling with big ideas, and sometimes when you're drafting something for the first time, big concepts seem intuitive and they fit together well and stuff like that. But when there's lots of abstract concepts in one sentence, or lots of big words in one single sentence, it becomes more and more confusing. And so the kind of metaphor I would use, and if we're thinking about the material culture perspective and stuff, you can think about big words as having big personalities, and so you can't put too many of them in one sentence. You can definitely have one or two that work well together or help explain each other or something like that. But usually it's going to have just if you're going to have a abstract, or even with just a word with plenty of letters, just having one of those in one sentence, in each sentence, or if you need to use it, having a sentence with just that one big word in it, and making sure that the other ones are small and simple and clear. That's a good strategy, and that's a good way of using a thesaurus, where it's okay, well, I want to talk about this, whatever, institutionalization, and it's but I'm using these other kind of bigger words, and so let's simplify those with a thesaurus. So yeah, just worth thinking about that. Reading it out loud is always good. If you're getting bored of that, or your voice you're just not interested. I use the word read aloud function. I find that that's pretty helpful, because it helps you to get out of your head, and you're missing. You kind of read over a lot of the mistakes. Sometimes a word might be in an opposite order or something, and you just know what you're trying to say, so you won't see it. But if you have the word read it aloud to you, or you read it aloud from a printed copy or from the screen or whatever, you're definitely more likely to notice it and fix that, and it'll just enhance the clarity of the draft. Finally, thinking back to the Stephen King story, other people will be able to identify so quickly the things that you're using as crutches or things that remain confusing. What I mean by crutches is, some people tend to, and I have had this as well a ton of times, but a certain word that you're using all the time, sometimes you're not necessarily consciously aware that you're starting all of your sentences with although or something like that, or now some people might use I've seen in myself, I've used unpacking as a crutch, and it's well, what are you really talking about? Some people if somebody else reads it, they'll be able to tell you exactly what's unclear, or what's okay, this is really repetitive, think of another word that you can use here because it's just getting annoying. Things like that. But again, it's worth noting it takes a bit of courage to show a draft to another person, so as long as you're asking somebody with some goodwill to read, and just be I want constructive feedback, maybe some tips too, as ways forward, rather than just this sucks, don't try to get somebody who would have that type of comment read a draft. Okay, yeah, so those are the basic editing resources. Now I'm just going to provide some, this is going to be kind of repetitive from other things from previous tutorials, but when it comes to moving towards editing sentences, as we talked about, it's really important to make sure that your sentences are active. Things that you should be asking yourself here are like, when you're reading a sentence, if you're like, things might be ambiguous, or like maybe the sentence doesn't work, or even if you just want to go through and like ask yourself these questions, it's like, what's the noun in the sentence, and does it come before the verb? That's just a basic way of making sure that the sentence is active. Also asking if your noun can act. That's a big issue in sociology papers, because things can have effects, or things can influence people or other things or whatever, but there are certain things that it's hard to be able to claim accurately that it can act. Like saying capitalism, dominates individuals, right? Like, it's like, or, capitalism tells us this is a kind of sentence that I'd see a lot in papers where it's like, can capitalism talk? I don't think so. Like, or how can it talk? If you're using that imagery, you're going to have to explain that. You can't just take that for granted that a society is telling us something, or capitalism pushes us some way, right? Like, these are, people can do that, but to use that kind of metaphorical language, you're going to have to explain how you're seeing that. So that's always good. And capitalism can often be, when in that type of sentence, can often be switched for like capital, because that's like a specific group of people and interest. Anyway, just worth mentioning. So yeah, active sentences, always good. Clause order, this is a big thing I struggle with, but 90% of the time it's going to be good. It's going to be better. It's going to improve the clarity of your point to say Y although X, rather than saying although blah 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 blah, this is the point I want to make, because then you're like, confusers might be or readers might be confused by the first part of the sentence and get kind of caught up in thinking about that and miss the main thing that you're trying to say. So it could be like, although hairless cats are ugly, I find most cats to be cute. Like, that works, but you could say like, most cats are cute, although hairless cats are ugly. No offense to people who love hairless cats out there, but that kind of helps to center the point that you're trying to make, rather than being like, I've got a problem with hairless cats. It's more like, I just want to, my main point is that cats are cute. Hopefully that example makes sense. I know it's not very sociological. Okay, length and ambiguity. I think that this is an important point to consider too. When you're looking back at your sentences, like, how long is it? And something that makes sentences longer are conjunctions. So these are like and, but, or. There's no strict rules on this, but you need to kind of ask yourself, like, how many conjunctions can my sentence handle? At some point, when there's, 2 or 3 ands in a sentence, maybe consider breaking that into 2 discrete sentences, and things like that. So the main thing here is that the longer the sentence is, the more ambiguous it gets, where you're like, okay, I've made it from the top of the page to the bottom, and it's been one sentence, and it's like, well, that it just gets more and more ambiguous. So being sure to make it, shorter sentences are less ambiguous, longer sentences are more ambiguous, and if you're trying to achieve absolute clarity, shorter sentences are going to go a long way. Okay, paragraphs. So again, this is stuff that we've covered before, so if some of this isn't familiar with you, make sure to go back and re-watch or check out the previous writing tutorials. Main thing here, the topic sentence and the supporting sentence need to cohere, and it needs to be clear which ones are which. If there's any, when you're editing, questions that you should be asking yourself in general are like, is there any conflict between my topic sentence or supporting sentences? And like I just mentioned, could you confuse something that you think is a supporting sentence for a topic sentence? That will be a point to edit to make sure that like the topic sentence is very clear and the supporting sentences are directly related to the main point there. The next question here, like, is there enough, too much, too little support? This one's going to be, yeah, this one's kind of difficult to judge, and this is another case where it's like an outside observer or an outside reader might be able to help you a lot, just to kind of be like, you keep going on about this and I don't care, or I'm convinced like you don't need to support this point, that cats are cute, like, you know, whatever. I'm not going to argue with you on that, you know, whatever. Anyway, just make sure that you're not kind of over explaining, or you're not providing too little explanation for your point. So yeah, this is a difficult thing. There's no strict rules here, but just kind of asking yourself this question will help you during the editing stages of either like, maybe I need to delete a sentence, maybe I need to add a sentence. Looking at the paragraph like as a unit too is helpful, to be like, is this fitting well on one page, or is it like spilling into, is it 2 pages long, or like, you know, if it's more than 1 page, it definitely needs to be cut. Editing the transitions, then this is basically like looking at the first and last sentences of your paragraphs. Doesn't always need to be like a specific transition of like last paragraph, you know, and I wouldn't suggest to ever say that either, but like, we just talked about this, now we're moving on to this. Sometimes that's an effective transition sentence. Every paragraph doesn't need one, but there should be some sense of flow, right? Like, I shouldn't be confused where it's like, okay, you're talking about, you know, this person's theory, and then, oh, this next paragraph is just about this other person's theory, right? So, for example, in writing a literature review, what you don't want to do is write, this author says this, full paragraph. This author argues this, full paragraph. This author argues this, full paragraph. It's really a weak literature review. I'm going to go over some more tips once we get to that section. But what I'm trying to say is that by the end of a paragraph, readers should kind of have a sense as to where you're going in the discussion, and then that first sentence of the next paragraph shouldn't be like, whoa, we've gone way somewhere else. You know, like if you're talking about your data and then your analytical strategy and then you know, whatever, like that makes sense. But if you're talking about your data and then you're talking about you know, what previous authors have said, and then you're talking about like the limitations of your data, and then you're, I don't know, introducing your research question, that's a really messed up order. So somebody reading that will be like, whoa, why are we jumping all over the place here? So just making sure that things kind of fit together. And again, this is tough and subjective, but is something that will become clearer as you edit and as you show it to like 1 or 2 people, and they kind of can figure out what you're trying to say just based on reading the paper, rather than having to ask you follow-up questions or whatever. Okay, last general piece of advice here, editing sections. This fits within kind of what I was just talking about, and this is basically just trying to say like everything should be in the right place. Like, you should talk about your data and your methods that you're proposing to use in the research design section. You shouldn't, you know, you're gonna have to mention that in the introduction section, but it shouldn't be fully fleshed out in like, this is how I'm gonna do the interviews, and this is how the interview questions I'm gonna ask, or, you know, whatever, these are the places I'm gonna go, and these are the activities I'm gonna watch. That shouldn't really appear so much in the introduction. That should be more like, I'm going to conduct interviews with this group of people, just to be like, okay, well, I see it's an interview study. That makes sense. I'm curious about this. Let me check out the data section, and then you can see it clearly there. And so, yeah, don't just make sure everything's in the right section. It's basically the point of this slide. So, yeah, don't introduce your research question in the conclusion. Don't get deep into scholarly debates or into the nitty-gritty of your data collection in the introduction. Kind of elaboration should be in places where readers will expect an elaborate explanation, whereas small, succinct explanation should be in the introduction. Things like that. Okay, great. So now we'll move on to some more specific questions that you should be asking yourself when you're editing like the distinct sections of the research paper. All right, introductions. So This piece of advice has really been driven into me by my dissertation supervisor, which I really appreciate, and I find it's really helpful. And when I read drafts of other papers or publish things that do this well, I'm always really impressed. And so yeah, and that piece of advice is that the first word and the first sentence of any paper does a lot of work. And what that work is setting expectations among readers. So you want to start with a strong first word to be like talking about this, right? Like cognition is conceptualized this way, or like creativity is boring. Something like that, right? Like it's like, whoa, okay, creativity is something I would generally think of as like exciting and interesting and artistic, and you're saying that it's boring, that's kind of like, okay, well, now I see where this author is going. I might not agree, but I'm along for the ride. But you see that like within first 3 words, we've got like a full topic. So again, I want to kind of link this back to the points I've been making about like thesis statements, and in the case of this assignment, like your research question. First sentences as well are like some of the final things that need to be written, or that sometimes they are the final things that are written, because they take so long to tweak to make them really, really effective. So just worth noting that, to say that you might not get the first words of your final draft in the first draft or the second draft. The second kind of sub piece of advice I have here is delete the introduction to your introduction. I find that a lot of students, and I'm guilty of this as well, is like you want to ease readers into the topic to say that like sociologists have studied material culture in various ways over the last 100 years, and there's been big debates about this, and then blah 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 blah, and then you get into like your actual thing where you're going towards. Yeah, delete that whole first thing, because it's like just start where you're going towards, because then readers won't be confused at being like, oh, are you just doing like a huge survey of this huge perspective or whatever? So that's always, that might be helpful in writing the first draft, right? Like definitely if it helps you if it gets you started writing, start writing that way. But in the editing stages, that's something that definitely needs to be deleted. Okay. Once you read your introduction that you have, ask yourself, after I read this introduction, do I know the answers to these questions really clearly? What's the object? What's the question? What's the name of the approach that you're taking? And what's the method? Again, you don't need to elaborate on all of this. Like if you're doing the interview method, you don't need to provide the questions. If you're doing ethnography, you don't need to outline the places and the activities and everything that you're going to be observing and stuff like that. But it should be clear that you're doing interviews, or it should be clear that you're doing ethnography or a survey or whatever. And the last question here is, can it fit on one page? So that's a typical thing with introductions, because this is the first draft. Introduction is something that spills off into the second page, right? But the final draft of your introduction should be neat. It should neatly fit onto one page. That's just general good practice. Might not be able to realize it in every case, but these are the things you should be shooting for. Okay, literature review. Some points of advice I have here. Oh, yeah, okay. Are to start big and get small. So, again, you don't have to do outside research for the class. I've been suggesting to make sure that you read all of the assigned readings and the supplemental readings for the perspective that you're choosing. And the general kind of structure of your lit review should, start big and then get small. And as you're getting smaller, it should be leading towards your research question. Like, you've already stated your research question in the introduction, so readers know what that is. But you need to define the kind of basics of the perspective that you're using, the definitions of the concepts that you're going to be engaging with, and stuff like that. And so as I'm saying, like, that like you got to start big and get small. So like if you're using the anthropological perspective or the sociology of art perspective or digital materialities perspective, right? You start big by saying like digital materialities perspective emphasizes blah 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 blah. And what you're doing in that paragraph is you're taking all of the readings from that week and being like, what do all of these authors agree about? Like, what is the material perspective, material culture perspective, or digital materialities perspective to them? And then, you know, there's got to be something there's got to be some reason why they're all grouped together, right? So what do they all agree about? But then what's one important point of disagreement among them? And then kind of bracket them off into their own different camps. What's your position on this debate that you've just identified? And then how does that position that you just took in terms of this like debate or this argument or a disagreement about a concept or a theory or whatever, how does that, your position on that debate, influence your research question? So that's kind of like starting at like this perspective is this, people have generally agree about this is what they disagree about, I think this, and so I'm asking this question. That's kind of the general structure of your lit review, and I've had some questions on this, so I'll just kind of say it this way, is that a really strong lit review will be able to do kind of answer these questions and answer what the perspective is, what did the scholars all agree about. That's one paragraph, right? Like that's like, if you're using the material culture perspective or whatever, you're gonna start thinking with these assumptions in mind, or with this with some sort of emphasis in your analysis or whatever. The next paragraph is like, okay, but these people can't all inherently agree about everything. Like, what's some sort of like fractured points of discussion among the articles and chapters and stuff that you've read? And then what do you think? Like, you need to advance your own thinking, right? Like, you got to think for yourself, and you need to kind of be like, well, I think that this is stronger for this reason, or I think that this is more valuable for my kind of research interest for this reason. Yeah, so might look a little bit longer than this, could be a little bit shorter, although I'd say that would be like the really strong and punchy, this would be a really strong and punchy literature review for the sake of the research proposal you're doing for this class. Okay, preliminary theory. Yeah, so this is kind of like, you've introduced us to your object and your question and the scholarly perspective that you're using and kind of what you think about it. So based on what you've read, what you know about your object, you know, what do you expect to find based on this question? Like, there's some sort of theoretical relationship between an abstract concept and a population. You know, the data that you're collecting and then that you're describing in the next section needs you to be able to kind of not know the answer. Like, or yeah, you shouldn't be able to kind of know the answer before you collect your data, or before you finish analyzing your data, I should say. But you can make an educated guess because you know things about your object, right? Like, you've read news articles, or you've engaged with it, or you know something about the history of it. You know something about the concept that you're asking about because all of these people have written about it and connected them to sociological theories and used it to explain things or to describe things or whatever. And have argued certain things about it. So based on like what you know about the object, the concept that you're using, the arguments that these previous authors have made, and the argument that you yourself have advanced above, what do you expect to find? So that's like your preliminary theorization, and just kind of guiding readers through your thought there is going to be really important. Can't really provide more specific advice on that because it's going to vary case per case on how like you're linking this object and this concept and everything, but I hope that makes sense. I'm not going to talk too much about this because there was a whole tutorial on the research design, but while you're editing the section, ask yourself, like, is it clear, like, what's the data, how will you collect it, how will you analyze it, you know, while you're analyzing it, what are you kind of looking for, are you trying to verify, falsify some sort of like that preliminary answer that you've developed in your preliminary theorization, and so yeah, if you do X, you can like prove or disprove some other thing. But yeah, if things are kind of not clear on this one, I would suggest to go back to the thinking empirically tutorial. Okay, so conclusions, as I mentioned before, like an introduction is like your first chance to get readers on the same page as you. Your conclusion is the last chance to convince readers that the data that you're proposing to collect is going to lead to a solid answer to your research question. For this assignment, we're also asking you to discuss the limitations of your research project. And I want to encourage you again to rethink these limitations not as something that like undercuts the knowledge that you're generating. It's more thinking of it as you're generating valuable but partial knowledge. So it's not that you're doing an interview-based study and you're accessing these subjective understandings and these subjective meanings of this object among the people that you interview, but you can't generalize to the general population. Right? Like that's generally thought of as like a limitation of interview research, but it's really just a feature of interview research. Like that's why you want to do it. You're not doing an interview study because you want to generalize to the population. You're doing an interview study because you want to achieve in-depth understanding about the meanings held by your research participants about a particular object. And there's a reason why you're interviewing these particular research participants. You're not doing a random selection like you would for a survey. So yeah, it's mostly just noticing that like you're developing a partial, you're developing valuable knowledge about this object, but it's still partial, right? Like you're developing a deep knowledge of the meanings that people attribute to some sort of object. If you were interested in understanding whether this is generalizable to the larger population, you could talk to a statistician and see if they could you could learn that from them, but you're not saying that like my knowledge can't access this and it's limited in that way because it was never able to or never kind of promised to be able to do that. So I don't know. I think it's just worth rethinking it that way and thinking more about like you are developing knowledge, but where does the knowledge kind of end? And how could you put the knowledge that you generated in conversation with somebody who could kind of go further than you or deeper than you, if you're doing the survey thing and you're talking about the limitations of that, Anyway, so I just want to encourage thinking about that because oftentimes when students talk about limitations, it's very superficial and kind of not really totally correct. So just make sure that you're thinking about your limitations in these terms. But once you've read your conclusion, which it'll be a bit longer than just like the traditional conclusion because we're asking you to do these two things. So it might be 2 paragraphs, might be 3, though I doubt you'll be able to kind of do both things in one paragraph. So I'd suggest you at least have 2 there. And so yeah, once you've read that first kind of concluding paragraph, it depends on how you want to put it, but the formal conclusion paragraph, have you summarized the paper? Does this seem like you've the readers leaving, finishing the paper, are they going to be like, oh, okay, yeah, I could see how this research question could be answered by this data. And then when you're talking about the limitations, when you're editing that paragraph, think about like, have you talked about the limits of your data for generating knowledge about this theory or this concept or whatever that you were proposing to study? So that's a valuable way of framing it and kind of a question that's worth asking yourself when you're editing the paper. If you can be like, oh, well, no, I answered this other thing. Again, that's like a section where it's like, okay, well, that's a delete because you need to keep things focused. Clarity has a lot to do with just like playing within the bounds of the structure. That will help to kind of guide readers towards the points that you want them to take away. Okay, great. So that's all the content we have for the writing advice. Now I'm just going to jump into a brief explanation of the academic exercise for this week. All right, so as I mentioned at the top, I'm going to ask you to edit your own work. So this should hopefully get you practicing, working through your own little fuzziness that you add into your writing, or the fuzziness that you need to pick out in the editing stage. So what I'm asking you to do here is, it's up to you, totally up to you. Select, copy and paste one paragraph from your previous assignment into a Word doc like twice. leave one as it is, and then edit the second one. So if you're looking for kind of advice here, I'd say just try to find a big paragraph, one that spans a page or two. If it spans an entire page, that's probably a good candidate, because then you can edit that down into one paragraph. If you're finding that like the paragraph that you're choosing to edit has like 2 topic sentences or whatever, right? Just pick one and go that direction. So just try to take one of the paragraphs. Dealer's choice. You can take the intro or something from another section. And go through and edit it. You're welcome to kind of use like the strike through thing if you want to kind of make it look like the Stephen King example, or you're welcome to just delete and rewrite as you wish. What I'm suggesting to do, like kind of the guidelines here, are make the paragraph shorter by at least 1 sentence. That's why it's going to be better to pick a bigger one. If you're picking a big one, don't delete just 1 sentence. You're going to need to delete a bunch. But so I'm trying to say like aim for 5 to 6. If the paragraph that you already selected is like 6 sentences or whatever, still try to get rid of 1. And aside from deleting sentences, try to delete any superfluous words. So these are things that are like repetitive. I'm not having any examples that come to mind, but just kind of things that could be that don't add any clarity, that just kind of repeat something that's already known, or clauses that are confusing or incorrect or something like that. So that's the skills exercise for this week. I'll look forward to reading them and reading your final assignment. So we'll leave it at that. I hope you have a good rest of your week, and take care.